Our brains have been hijacked by a number of chemicals, toxins, media, pornography, alcohol, drugs, things in the air, things in the water, who knows what. But the truth is our brains are not always our own. We have had our neurochemical transmitters disrupted, our hormonal pathways disrupted, and even losing a sense of free will as we make decisions day after day that lead to negative outcomes. Today, we are going to talk about the underlying factors in your brain that lead you to engage in behaviors that may or may not be negative for you, and teach you how you can gain control back, grab it back from the bad guys, and focus yourself on behaviors that are going to lead you to healthy, wealthy, productive, enjoyable relationships and outcomes in your life. Stick with us. It's coming up next right here with Jack and Dr. Deep. Hey, everybody. I am Jack Murphy, co-founder and CEO of Rebel Health Alliance and a co-host of our podcast here. We haven't even picked a name for it yet. One day we'll pick a name. Dr. Deep, introduce yourself, sir.
Hey, Jack, good to be with you again. Dr. Deep here, co-founder, chief medical officer of the Rebel Health Alliance. Excited to be having another wonderful conversation with you.
Indeed. And today, guys, we're talking about something that affects virtually every single one of us. There are hostile actors that have taken over our brains and through chemical manipulation have gotten us to do things that aren't good for ourselves. We constantly make decisions that lead to negative outcomes, whether it's through food, through cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, porn, media, social media, all kinds of things that we do that don't have positive outcomes for ourselves. And I'm wondering why. I'm beginning to feel like we've been invaded, that somebody has just taken over our brains and is just using us like a puppet, like a marionette, to do the things that they want us to do, which is basically be consumers, make them money, and not have any sense of agency. Deep, I know we brought this up. You brought this to my attention because there was a couple of stories recently in your life that really highlight, or things in the media that highlight what we're talking about here. Tell me one of the stories you had in mind.
Yeah, Jack, thank you. I think what we're talking about here, the hijacking of our minds, plays out every single day when I'm seeing patients. When people are coming to me saying, I don't know, I just make the wrong decision. There's just something about it. At nighttime, I'm just sitting there. One of my patients the other day called it the witching hour, and where, he just doesn't seem to have control over what he's putting into his body. So why is that? It got us thinking about the real biochemical, neurohormonal mechanisms behind how we make decisions. So I want to start out by telling two stories about two separate patients that I've taken care of previously in my life. The first one, her name is Aubrey, great woman, had a beautiful smile and a great sense of humor. She grew up in the Deep South, and the culture there around eating and food can sometimes lead people down the wrong path. By the time I had seen her, she was something like 400 pounds. She had trouble getting in and out of the office. I saw her once in the hospital and she had stroke-like symptoms. And this is a heartbreaking kind of dehumanization of people. But due to her size, we needed to get an MRI, and we couldn't do that in the hospital because her weight at that point was too much for the MRI bed. So we literally had to ship her to the local zoo in order to do the imaging that we needed to do. I mean, just think for a moment what that might do to someone's psyche. So fast forward a couple of years, I've taken care of this poor woman and have tried everything. We really went deep on a lot of different therapies and sending her to all sorts of specialists. She unfortunately passed away in her early 50s from a massive heart attack. She kind of knew it was coming. She didn't sort of see a way out. And up till the day she died, she was eating something like 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day. She just could not control herself. A lot of it was fast food. Much of it was processed food. And, it broke my heart. I couldn't save her. And that story stuck with me. I had another patient. His name is Michael. He was a roofer, manual laborer, good man, had a family, had been doing his job diligently. He had a bad accident one day where he fell off a ladder. He fractured one of the vertebrae in his back and had significant pain from that. There's a lot of ways to treat pain. This individual was put on opioid medications, not by me, but by the industrial complex, right? The system. It's so much easier to just see someone, throw a medication at them and tell them to come back in a couple months and we'll see how things are going. We'll talk about this later, about these stats, but 75% of Americans who end up taking heroin started because they were prescribed an opioid at some point in their life. Think about that. 3 out of 4 people who take heroin entered that journey because of the medical complex that put them on these drugs. We don't have to get into this now, but there's the whole Purdue Pharmaceuticals and Sackler family. And if you're interested, you should go look some of that up. But he had such a hard time weaning himself from opioids, was finding stuff on the street, was finding heroin. He had, again, young children, a wonderful wife. He also passed away in his early 40s, actually. And I remember having a conversation with him where he said, "Doc, you just don't get it. I don't have control over this. There is something else that makes me fiend for these things. I can't stop myself." And despite all the various treatments we tried, he succumbed to this. And so you play this out in day-to-day life, in our patient interactions every single day. And you start to ask yourself the question, as you mentioned just previously, what is it that causes us to make decisions that are not in our best interest? And more importantly, what is it that gives us that high, that euphoric feeling, that reward that tells us we have to go chasing that thing, even though we know it is incredibly self-destructive to us? There's a lot of answers to that question. It's not a simple topic, but one very key piece that we fail to discuss often is our dopamine pathways. And today we want to unpack that a little bit and understand where are the chemical, the neurohormonal influences coming from that cause people to have these kind of self-destructive behaviors. So let's talk about it a bit, Jack.
So we've just told 2 stories, one of a woman who basically ate herself to death, and the image of her having to go to the zoo for her MRI and imaging is just horrifying. And I feel for that woman who had to go through that experience. And it made me think about all of the people who would require something like that today. And those numbers are just growing every single minute of the day. And then you tell a story about a guy that gets prescribed a medication that takes over his life. The medication was meant to help him, takes over his life and leads him onto the street seeking heroin, and he ends up dying too. And there's a commonality here. You may not originally, at first glance, look at these 2 stories and think there's a similar underlying theme, but apparently there is. And then you add in other phenomenon today that we see, people endlessly scrolling social media, girls, teenage girls. I just went to a volleyball tournament, and even there with athletes, focused athletes, you turn your head, there'd be a whole team of 13-year-old girls just like this. You go out into the park, you see people just sitting on street benches and park benches, just scrolling their phones. There's stories about guys on the internet who think they're addicted to pornography because they can't stop viewing it. People who eat and drink things that they don't want to, even though they know it's not good for them and they want to be lean and fit, but somehow they find themselves putting hand to mouth. All of this begs the question, or raises the issue, whatever it is. Are we necessarily in control of our behaviors? And if not, who is? And then what about free will? So many topics to discuss. Let's get into it, Dr. Deep. You're suggesting or stating to me that our dopamine pathways are the common thread among many of these behaviors. Maybe it's not the exact reason. Could be. Let's get into it. Dopamine, what is it? Somebody, I think, would just generally say, that's the feel-good hormone. Is that really what it is? Because I don't think eating yourself to death feels good, nor does scrolling your whole life away on a cell phone, but yet people feel compelled to do it. Why?
Well, good question, Jack. I think dopamine itself is a neurotransmitter, and we'll show a couple of figures here later on what that means. But we have these neurons, and in between each neuron, there's a small space. And in order for one neuron to stimulate the next, it releases chemicals into that, what we call that presynaptic space. And that causes actions on the downstream neuron. And, we can get pretty technical, but dopamine does make you feel good in the moment. I think that's where this feel good hormone really comes from. It's the downstream impact of those decisions that are so destructive and that kill us. There are other very important functions of dopamine besides just making us feel good. It is implicated, or it is one of the primary drivers of our motor function, for example. So you think of people that have Parkinson's, that is entirely a dopaminergic pathway issue and problem that we'll talk about. It helps us with our executive functioning and our memory. It has impact in our prefrontal cortex in that way. So dopamine is important. It definitely has its place in our biology. Evolutionarily, that high that we would get from the kill, right? From being able to finally feed ourselves and our families is what kept our species alive and kept us going. So dopamine is important. What has happened, however, in our modern day, as you mentioned, is all these different players have gotten pretty smart about that. And they have actually found ways to hijack our dopamine system. So let's talk a little bit about what actually is dopamine. We're showing you the figure here of what the biochemical structure of dopamine is. It's synthesized from initially an amino acid called tyrosine. It goes through a series of different steps, and it's embedded in these neurons to help signal various things like we talked about. There are a lot of really complex pathways through which dopamine is used. There are things like the nigrostriatal pathway, the mesolimbic pathway, the tuboinfundular pathway, and all these things. You can see it on the diagram here. We don't want to get into too much of that detail here, but how dopamine is produced and used in the body is a pretty natural, normal sort of process. It's when we overdo it and when we are slamming these receptors, there's a few different types of dopamine receptors, that we start to see problems with all of these various conditions. Even things like schizophrenia, ADHD, these are all primarily issues with dopamine and these dopamine signaling pathways. So again, it is an important compound in our body. It has all sorts of important impacts. What we're talking about, though, is what happens when bad actors have figured out how to take advantage of that to drive our behavior in ways that are not serving our self-interest.
Okay, so basically this is a perfectly normal neurochemical that we need to perform all kinds of regular day-to-day tasks, and that, typically speaking, guides us towards behaviors that are going to do good things for us. Eat food, be around friends and community, exercise, probably listen to music, love people, achieve things. There would be no feeling, but this is where the feeling comes from, right? The feeling that you get from doing these good things. And so when you're in a community-based setting and you're engaging in relationships and achieving common goals and sharing common values, you get a good feeling. Because why? Because when you engage in community, you have a higher level of productivity, your safety increases, you can do better and more different things, you can become happier, healthier, and wealthier. And the way that we've evolved to induce that type of behavior is to make it feel good to cooperate in groups. Got it. Same with engaging in personal, love relationships, same thing with achieving things in your life. But then there are ways in which it gets hijacked, which is what we're going to be talking about, because this system is meant to guide you towards productive, healthy outcomes. And I imagine 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, it was probably a pretty reliable system. It got us here, right? So What is happening when we talk about things being hijacked?
You're right, Jack. For all those reasons you mentioned, dopamine is important. There's a basic survival needs like food, water, sex, reproduction. There's a secondary impacts like you mentioned, community, achieving one's goals, music, love, art. All of these things hit dopamine in an appropriate, positive kind of way. What happens though when the Cokes, the Nabiscos, the Lay's potato chips, the Purdue Pharmaceuticals, the porn industry, alcohol has found ways to realize that, man, we can have recurring revenue from customers if we can just convince them that this thing feels so good that they have to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it, often in increasingly elevated volumes. So there are dopamine receptors in our brains. There's 5 different types. It gets pretty confusing with the nomenclature, but there are D1 and D2 type dopamine receptors, and they each have different impact and function in our brains. What can happen when you overstimulate dopamine is, one, you just flood that system, that presynaptic state or space that I talked about earlier. You flood that with dopamine. So every time you're eating that ice cream, there's some reward pathway that gets triggered that says, man, this is amazing. I love this. I need to keep eating more of this. I need more of this sugar. I need more of this processed food. Over time, however, those receptors that are accepting that dopamine start to get oversaturated, and they start to say, man, I don't even know what to do with all of this dopamine, and I'm already saturated because you're hitting it with so much of these rewarding kind of behaviors that people's response to each of those stimuli starts to go down. That's why you see addiction sometimes spiral out of control, where people are able to consume more and more and more of these kinds of substances that are clearly self-destructive to them. There's all sorts of studies and many more that are not published and would never be shown to the public that these big organizations know this. They understand what drives consumer behavior. We'll talk about social media later on, but there's a great interview by Chamath Palihapitiya, that won an early individual at Facebook, where he basically admits this, where he says, we were manipulating the algorithm in order to manipulate people's dopamine response. We knew what was happening. And part of his reason for leaving was his conscience. He couldn't stay there any longer, knowing that we are, again, hijacking people's brain chemistry in order to do things that might feel good in the moment when you get your notifications or your likes, and you start to realize that people enjoy what you're saying. But that addictive behavior is where it turns into something that none of us have control over anymore.
I mean, we all here on social media can relate to the power of engagement, notifications, little dings, looking down at your Twitter and seeing 20 plus notifications waiting for you, or the rush of just exciting content, or, scary content, or things that are going to elicit anger and other emotions in you. We know we're all being manipulated. And I think that we're all kind of coming to grips with the fact that we need to do something about that, and we need to live a life that's going to put the control back into our hands rather than leave it up to these people who basically sneak attack us, right? It was a sneak attack. Nobody expected when they got their first iPhone, however long ago, that what it was a key to unlocking their brain for outside influence. But I think everybody was like, sweet, I can call my mom, I can send a text message, I can do some, quick Google search or get directions or whatever. We didn't realize that it was like a Trojan horse, and it snuck into our brain and now manifests itself in our spending. It controls your wallet, controls the things that you eat, the emotions that you feel, places that you go, the people you engage with, whether or not you find yourself isolated from other human beings. And I think this is something I want to touch on later, perhaps, because we're talking about addictions and we're talking about dysregulated dopamine. But we just earlier mentioned that community and engaging in personal relationships can raise your dopamine levels and can make you feel good. So if you are at once hijacked into doing these negative behaviors and isolated from doing the good behaviors, then the only place that you're going to get the dopamine response is going to be by doing the negative things. And I do believe I've read studies about addiction that show that a large component of it is isolation, and that the community element of recovery, of 12-step programs and just other ways of getting beyond the alcohol addiction is about having and fostering and maintaining these successful personal relationships, which is of course what alcohol destroys at the same time. I think the study was that there was like a rat in a cage with the cocaine by himself, and he just took all the cocaine until he died. But then there was like cocaine in a cage of rats with like 50 of them or whatever, and none of them did, because they were all living in this community and engaged with each other and whatever else. So interesting things to think about. What's next? Go ahead,
Jack.
yeah.
It just goes back to our 7 pillars of what's so important in life, right? And you should check out the video if you'd like to learn more about each one of those. But the 2 that we focus on at the end are have community and have purpose. Oftentimes, when you're surrounded by the type of community that will hold you accountable, frankly, that will pull you back from the ledge when you need it, I think social media can be a great connector. You and I met through social media, right? And it's changed our lives in many ways. And there is a real power and beauty to that. But again, all of these things tip over into pathologic states when they start to have negative impacts on your work, on your relationships, on your overall health and well-being. Having purpose is another thing. You definitely see functional alcoholics out there, but it's rare to see extremely successful people who are completely dependent and have no regulation on their own dopamine, who don't know how to pull themselves back or recognize when they may be hijacked and find the resources that are important to ensure that they control those kinds of things. So certainly, I think those 2 are some of the most important drivers of all of the addiction that we see in our modern world. As you mentioned, isolation, not having those dopamine hits in very positive ways like our ancestors used to, leads us to seek that in other ways and fill that void by doing self-destructive behaviors like we talked about.
Something that people can relate to these days are even like Adderall and stimulants, and people get addicted to Zins and caffeines. And just a side note, guys, like being addicted to caffeine and nicotine is not a personality. Like do more than that. I see it all over social media. Got my Zins, got my Celsius, gonna get all jacked up. No, these things are not the centerpiece of a personality. Where do you want to go with this next, Deep? Because there's 50 different branches that we could go down.
Definitely.
What do you have in mind?
Helpful, Jack, is maybe unpacking a few of the most common addictions in our lives and just highlighting the scope of the issue here and showing what dopamine hijacking has done to our modern society. We talked about our poor patient, Aubrey, prior to this, and obesity is a major one. We have study after study that shows that high saturated fat, high sugar, ultra processed foods, things like MSG, definitely hit these dopamine reward pathways. There's an interesting dynamic here with kind of what you were mentioning, the feel good hormone. Dopamine also, it's the anticipation of these things. It is the chase. It's getting after it and finding a way. And I saw this whole funny thing from a guy on Twitter, Ed Lattimore, who talks about, are you going to let a crackhead out hustle you? You know, they work 24/7 to get their fix. And while he's saying that in jest, there is some truth to that, right? That is such a powerful driver that can cause someone to take action in their life in all sorts of different ways. There's definitely other physiologic impacts of obesogens, of drugs and alcohol, which we'll talk about, but that anticipation piece that dopamine provides to our brain is, again, going back to our ancestors, I think really was the thing that kept us alive, was the power of the chase and achieving that goal to feed the tribe in order to live on another day. Important part of the human experience. But with obesogens in particular, with a lot of these food companies that we know are targeting these kinds of pathways, we have what we see now, right? 60 to 70% of Americans are overweight or obese, 40, 50% are pre-diabetic or diabetic, and those numbers aren't slowing down. We're on a runaway train there.
Let me just get something straight.
Please.
There are specifically designed foods and known substances in the food that are there in the food in order to increase your anticipation of eating them and increase the reward that you feel upon consumption. And then basically set your mind towards the next time you're going to have a chance to consume those foods. That is addiction, right? Like the obsession with the obtaining, acquiring, and utilization of drugs, whether it's your heroin or whatever, is the hallmark of addiction. Like you get your drugs and then the next thing you're thinking about is how do I get more? When do I get more? When are we going to do that? And I have seen videos of children literally quivering with excitement as the cake starts coming to them, right? Like in the old days, we didn't have foods quite like that would cause us this sense of anticipation and reward system. But today it's all around us, and it's probably insidiously in so many things that we think are benign. What kind of foods could we eat that are going to not trigger that type of response, but simply just give you the nutrients that you need and not give you too many calories and keep your gut health in good shape and just be what food is supposed to be rather than this whole crazy emotional adventure that people are on? Like, what do we need to avoid and what do we need to focus on? I'm sure this is like nutrition 101 and nothing's going to be too shocking, but like in this context of this conversation now, I want to know what food I can eat that's not going to F my brain up and make it so that there is like an outside alien controlling my brain just so that they can get rich.
Well, it is a little bit of the 101 that we've talked about in prior episodes as well. Shopping around the perimeter of the grocery store where you're looking at fresh vegetables, fruits, lean meats, good cuts, and not the processed box stuff. All of that stuff that's shelf stable, that is in the middle of the grocery store, tends to be the stuff that has been laden and has been researched extensively in order to drive behavior in a certain kind of way. These ancestral kind of diets, well, I think there's all sorts of things to unpack there. And we've got a great episode on the 4 or 5 drivers and models of obesity, but you don't see people dying from chicken and fish addiction, right? You see people dying from, if you're going to talk about meat, it's the processed sausages, the bacons, the pepperoni, the kind of junk that we know is not good for us. In addition, it's all the high calorie, ultra processed, high sugar, high fat content foods, typically in the middle of the grocery, again, that are specifically designed. And unless you realize this, you are just a victim to these bad actors. I had a good discussion with a patient the other day where we were talking a little bit about the role of food in our lives and how we see it. So many of us see food as a reward. And when you talk about the little kids who get all giddy with their sugar high and their cake or their milkshake that's coming, it's often because we've portrayed that as a rewarding kind of thing, and it reinforces those loops. When we are shopping on the perimeter, when we're eating the kinds of foods, don't get me wrong, there's dopamine in a different kind of way. And it's all about controlling that in order to have positive outcomes in your life. When you exercise and you feel your best and you're growing and you're getting your mile time lower and you're going up on weight, that is a kind of dopamine as well. I look forward to getting after it in the gym. I feel good when I've hit a personal record. I would argue that that kind of dopamine stimulus is what will propel our species forward. So again, I don't want to demonize dopamine itself. It's just, who are the folks that are causing us to chase dopamine by doing things that are self-destructive to us rather than the things that are important and beneficial in our lives, the reason why dopamine even exists in the first place.
Sure. As we said earlier on today, this is an integral part of who we are as human beings, because we need to be guided towards the things that are going to be good for us. I'm maybe a little sidetracked here, but I want to ask a philosophical question, Deep. When I began testosterone replacement therapy all those years ago, I noticed a profound impact on my mood, my desires, sexual desires, appetites, like how horny you are as a guy. And all these things at the time just seemed, it was like normal. Okay, yeah, this is what I think. This is how I feel. This is my perspective. But there have been times where like I've stopped taking the testosterone replacement and it goes away. And then those feelings and those desires and those intents and those interests, they go away as well. And if you've ever experimented with super physiological levels of testosterone, you know what I'm talking about, because all of those things are heightened times in a big way. That's one part of the question. Another part of the question is that if there are obesogens in the environment that are making people eat things that are not good for them, that disrupt the various hormonal pathways in their body that signal things like I'm full, I don't need to eat, or signal things like I'm hungry, I need to eat, or change the way your body shuttles nutrients around from one part of your body to the other, that are changed by external factors, exogenous factors to yourself, that then change your behavior and change the things that you actually want, wish, or desire. Does all of this add up to like how much control are we really in, or are we just one giant sack of hormones triggering response, reward, and behaviors that just based on whatever the chemical balance is in our body at the time, versus free will people who can just make decisions on their own and their perspectives are clear and their analysis are true and their wants and desires are authentic and genuine? Or are they hijacked by outside forces that have nothing but your worst interests at heart? And if so, like, what does that mean? I know it's not a philosophy show, but I keep coming back to this. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, Jack. And I guess how I see it is, there is this battle going on in our bodies and our minds at all times between our deep brain structures, our primordial subconscious behaviors that are driving us to do things that we don't even know. These are the kind of centers in our midbrain and our pons that control breathing and our heart rate, things that we don't think about. But actually that's where all of these dopamine receptors and pathways tend to exist as well, probably for many of the reasons we talked about. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's our prefrontal cortex and our higher learning centers and the logic that we know every time we're eating this ice cream, like, man, this is a stupid decision. Or every time we're pursuing that destructive behavior, there is always a part of us that's saying, don't do this. This is not good for you. We know that. But which one's going to win? It's kind of the angel on your right and the devil on your left shoulder, where you constantly have this battle going on. I think where people win and are successful in life is when they can overpower some of those core instinctual subconscious needs and desires that come up and control those in the right way. They are the ones that are deciding, my logic is going to override the deep-seated drive and instinct for whatever it is, because of my hormonal milieu, because of my addiction pathways. Those that tend to not do as well are leading this unconscious life, as you might say, where their free will is not powerful enough to overcome whatever hedonistic behaviors that they know they're engaging in that are destructive to their lives and their communities. So how do you continue to have your logic override that? It comes through a lot of hard work, comes through practice, it comes through putting yourself in those scenarios and making the hard choices. And that's what you mentioned, Alcohol Anonymous and these 12-step programs. That's what they actually do such a good job of, is teaching you in the moment. And there's not that many great treatments for addiction. There are medications that can help tamp down some of these desires and blunt that dopamine response. But the primary treatment is typically cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're really thinking and talking through things with people, trying to understand, what is my trigger? What am I doing when I'm unconsciously consuming or participating in a behavior that's not good for me? How do I recognize that in the moment and have my logic override those decisions? So free will, I think, is what sets us apart, frankly, from much of the animal world. And being able to build that capacity is something that takes a lifetime and that many of us are continuing to work on every single day. But fundamentally, we have to understand when we're not in control, when there are these deep brain structures that are chemically driving us to different kinds of behaviors, and be able to override that in real time.
So is the executive function, this decision-making function, is that impacted by your dopamine response and dopamine levels? If so, let's go deeper into that. If not, what is it? How, and maybe we're getting off script a little bit, but that's okay. How can we bolster this ability to overcome both your deep rooted limbic, reptilian, influences, and or those being hijacked by other, substances, obesogens, media consumption, et cetera, how do we strengthen that thing inside of us, which is able to absorb that urge, absorb that whatever response? I'm not the doctor, things that happen inside you, these feelings you have, the urge to eat this thing, to watch this thing, to pick up your GD phone again and start scrolling. What is it in our brain function, and how do we strengthen and enhance that function?
Yeah, that's the question, right, Jack? That's what we're all trying to figure out every day. I think maybe it'd be helpful if we talked about a particular addiction. So let's just take alcohol. This is one of the most common addictions in our world. Here's a few stats on alcohol. 29.5 million people aged 12 and older, that's more than 10% of our population, had an alcohol use disorder in 2022. 753,000 people, adolescents, 12 to 17 years old, had an alcohol use disorder. It's likely much higher than that. It's significantly underdiagnosed, but the symptoms of that are not being able to control how much you're consuming, putting yourself in positions where you are continuing to be exposed to that harmful stimuli, failing to fulfill some of your major obligations to your family, to your work, to your community, and continuing to consume even though you know it is destructive. So oftentimes addiction, it's rare to find people who actually don't believe they have a problem. There are some of those that are just not far along enough on the continuum, but almost everyone I've ever talked to that's been addicted to alcohol or tobacco or obesogens, they know they have a problem. They know that it is causing trouble in their lives. And so again, there are some medications. We use things like naltrexone and disulfiram and acamprosate. They have different mechanisms of action. Naltrexone does actually decrease that craving by impacting dopamine. Disulfiram, on the other hand, just makes the response to alcohol so terrible that you don't want to consume it anymore. You start becoming nauseous and diarrhea and headaches and flushing. And so you're kind of giving yourself an exogenous substance that says, even if I drink, I know I'm going to feel terrible because of that. And you create a new pathway. You create a negative pathway where you are associating that consumption of that harmful substance with these negative kind of symptoms. Again, the most common and the most successful treatments for these are things like cognitive behavioral therapy, of motivational enhancement therapy, contingency management, meaning what am I going to do in the moment if I'm presented with the option to drink versus not drink? What is my contingency going to be? Sometimes I talk to patients about, if you feel the social pressure to kind of fit in, I think alcohol is a good one to talk about because it is so ubiquitous in our culture. It's just the thing that people do. Let's go get a drink. Let's have a glass of wine. But maybe you can find ways where you don't have to explain yourself, right? So I talk to patients, go get a tonic water with lime with a little straw in it. And no one has to know whether there's gin or vodka or whatever in there, but you feel like you're part of the social milieu and what's sort of going on. Family therapy is another interesting one, actually, where there's really good studies around bringing your people closest to you and helping them express in helpful ways, not just telling you you're a terrible person, but helping you realize, like, Dad, you missed my recital, and that was really important to me. Or, partner, we had our anniversary planned and you were blitzed during the entire thing. Or, son, we had this wonderful Christmas dinner and you threw up all over the ham. And there are ways to kind of communicate these things that help people reinforce that prefrontal cortex, that logic that says, oh man, I am really impacting those around me by this. Again, a lot of this is about recognizing it, understanding the impact that you're having on your own self and with those around you, and finding ways to cope with that, finding your contingencies, doing the hard thing of avoiding that self-destructive behavior in the moment. It's definitely the hardest thing for most of us, but that's sort of where the science is right now.
Bringing awareness to the decision making in the moment is the key. I'm not perfect. In the past, I have definitely seen myself make decisions in the moment that were not reflective of the entire, cascade of side effects that could happen, to say the least. And there are so many people who behave like that. And then there are probably times in every single person's life at some point in the day where they're behaving that way. I think the tricky thing here is that your brain tells you you want it. So you like have an authentic, genuine urge that feels endogenous, like comes from you. And so you're like, yeah, I want this. So I just do it. And there's no filter. There's no little voice. There's no nothing, because an hour ago, I definitely don't want to do that. Definitely don't want to do that. But now you're like, yes, I definitely want to do that. And that, I think, is the part where people can feel hijacked. And I know that alcohol is a very clear one. You drink it, you feel good. Most people become more social. They have more fun. They get more relaxed. It lowers your inhibitions. And frankly, it just makes you feel good. There's just no question about it. Alcohol makes you feel good in the short term. But it's these more insidious, subtle things. The food, the social media scrolling, the isolation. I mean, I just pulled up some basic stats on social media addiction. It's millions of kids with social media addiction. And addiction as defined by negative impact on their relationships and their ability to conduct their daily lives, knowing full well that there's going to be negative consequences from engaging in the social media behavior, but still continuing to engage in the social media behavior. And part of me that is nervous is when I'm thinking about maybe, one of these things easy to manage. Like, okay, don't drink alcohol. Got it. Don't go on your phone. Oh, okay, got that. Don't eat this thing. Okay, got that. Don't do this. All of a sudden, there's a million attack vectors on our dopamine and decision making reward centers that I don't want to say is hopeless, but if the struggle is real, let's just say that the struggle is real. And I think that my evolution in thinking about the obesity problem has brought me from a place of I never individually fat shamed people, but I definitely like collectively fat shamed. And I was like, you're obese. Stop being obese. Quit fucking eating. Move around. Do this, do that. And now I have so much more sympathy for people who are stuck in that scenario, most of whom, you can throw away the outlier examples of the people online that stuff their face for food, for money, or whatever, lie about it. Most everybody doesn't want to be that way. And yet there's a hopelessness that sets in because in the moment you don't think about it. In the moment your brain is hijacked. In the moment your hunger and being, I can't say the word, satiety, sensations are all hijacked and skewed. And so you think you have these authentic feelings, but you really don't. So I guess what it all comes down to for me is we have to have a collective acknowledgement that the obesogenic, the dopamine hijack, we'll have to come up with another word for that one, right? Like the environment in which we're all just under attack by sophisticated players who are trying to control our behaviors for their profit and for their benefit with total and complete disregard for ours are constant, pervasive, everywhere at all times. And the most difficult thing is that you need to eat. So gosh, that's just opening the door. Or, in my case, like I make my living using my phone and social media. So there, just opening the door. I definitely have some level of social media addiction. I reach for my phone all the time for no reason, all the time, constantly, all the time. Yes, I make money that way. Yes, I help people that way. Yes, I use it to do good in the world, but it's still a real thing. The bottom line is that we have to accept this first off, like in all dealing with all addictions, accept that there's a problem, and we collectively have to accept that there's a problem about all these attack vectors on us, and then to figure out a way to have a plan, to be aware, to be in the moment, to build this wall, fortress, to like keep this crap out, so that you can just like get back to the business of being a normal, healthy, productive human being. It's no reach to say that this is unprecedented in history.
Absolutely. I mean, and part of bringing up all these stats is not to lament that it's hopeless and doomed. It's to draw attention to the fact that you're not the only one suffering. Actually, the majority of people probably have some addiction of some sort. You talked about social media. Something like 30 million Americans are likely diagnosed with that. 30% of Americans, so you're talking close to 100 million people, consider themselves to be addicted to social media. And there are these really interesting reports of just the tick that we kind of have, right? You just open your phone and you just click on this and click on this and click on this, just because, even if there's no notifications there, you're just kind of running through the checklist. And I always wonder if like our great grandparents came back and teleported, they'd just be like, what is everyone doing? Right? Like, what are you even talking about? And that is because we've been hijacked. One other one to maybe point on, and then let's finish up by talking about what we can do about this a little bit more concretely, is porn. And we've been seeing this in social media a lot more recently around porn addiction and porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Let's just throw out some stats. 90% of young men in the United States report watching porn with some regularity. This one blew my mind. On Pornhub, there are 90 billion videos that are viewed by more than 64 million visitors daily. I mean, these are staggering stats. Like the amount of work and science and evil, diabolical plans that has gone into addicting our society to these kinds of things has far-reaching implications. I think there's a whole generation. You mentioned the volleyball players scrolling on their social media, the young guys that are addicted to porn. Like, I wonder what's going to happen in 20 years when we look at birth stats and relationships. I've already seen all sorts of statistics around how few 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds have ever engaged in an intimate relationship with another human being, likely driven by much of the porn industry, the social media industry, these abnormal expectations and what it sort of does to our dopamine. And there's just no satiating that kind of strong, ever pervasive influence on most of our lives.
How do we chip away at our addictions, be they social media, pornography, alcohol, or other bad activities where our own neurochemical systems have been hijacked by other people, other things, or other chemicals? What can we do?
Well, Jack, as we've mentioned, psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, talking it out, having your community and purpose, all of these are extremely important. But here's a few other science-backed, driven ways that we can start to tamp down our dopamine addiction. So one, diet. We know that there's certain foods that can influence dopamine levels. Things that are rich in tyrosine that we mentioned as a precursor can start to give you a little bit of that dopamine influence without having to actively engage in those self-destructive kind of behaviors. Almonds, bananas, lean meats, avocados, all of these things have been found to boost our natural dopamine production so that we're not feeling like we have to get that exogenously from somewhere else. The antioxidants that are found in a lot of our food as well can decrease some of the dopamine neurons from feeling excessive damage. Exercise, that's another extremely important one. We get that dopamine release, and much of this is about how do we replace the dopamine that we're seeking from all of these negative exogenous compounds with more positive types of influence. Sleep is one that probably don't think about enough. Sleep has a profound impact on regulating our dopamine receptors. We talked about that earlier, but being able to have healthy functioning number of receptors that aren't constantly bombarded, that actually receive the neurochemical in the appropriate way, all of those are improved through a good night's sleep. Sunlight is another one that has all sorts of impacts on various biochemical pathways, on many of these dopamine pathways that we talked about that can tamp down the need for, again, these exogenous compounds. Stress management is a huge one, especially in our day-to-day lives. I think when we are always chasing work and those emails and feeling the cortisol spike from our day-to-day lives, our natural reaction is to seek some brief pleasure. And so, again, we'll go back to that patient we were talking about with the witching hour. He was finding that I've worked all day. I come home, I take care of my kids and my family. I get back on, I see the emails, my cortisol spikes again, and I just need something that feels good in the moment. And so I reach for the chocolates, I reach for the snacks, I reach for the ice creams, I reach for the bourbon, I reach for the cigar, whatever it is that we all do. Last one I'll mention is there are folks who advocate for kind of a dopamine detox, a dopamine sort of holiday, if you will. What would happen if you just went to the middle of the desert in Arizona? We actually had a patient that recently did that. Him and his wife traveled to Arizona, literally went to the desert and put away all their phones, had bland diet the entire time. And it was tough the first couple of days. You're constantly thinking, you still have those tics and that need and desire to chase these things. But after a couple of days, they really started to notice all sorts of things. They start to question, well, why is it that I am constantly scrolling social media? Why is it that I'm constantly reaching for that beer, that glass of wine? And you start to have those important conversations with yourself. And you realize, even after a few days of pulling back from those addictions, that you have much more power than you actually realize, that you can control those impulses and those emotions more than you realize. And it takes, though, putting yourself in that situation in order to actually give yourself the confidence that you can overcome. So I'd urge all of you and all of us to continue finding positive dopamine hits, engage in the things that are beneficial in your lives that dopamine was meant to stimulate, that can replace all of the other things that you're really, substituting that for more than anything. So have purpose, exercise, eat well, have great relationships, find beauty in music and art, do things that allow you to achieve and overcome, and periodically push yourself to just put it all away. Go on the digital detox, go on the dry January. It's Lent right now, and we have several patients that are abstaining from certain things, and realize that you don't ever have to actually go back. You can find ways to reduce that biochemical need. You can find ways to outsmart the hijackers that are out there that are trying to get you to behave in a certain way. Realize that they are funding and finding ways to manipulate your behavior for their own benefit. And we have to take back that control, and we can do that.
Well said, Dr. Deep. I think the thing that comes back to every time is awareness. We have to bring awareness to these behaviors so that we can make change. An example, if you get a Whoop strap and you look at your heart rate variability and your resting heart rate after you consume alcohol, and there are red lights flashing red, boom, awareness. Alcohol messes with my heart. It messes with my sleep. It makes me feel like crap the next day. I have low energy. My recovery is 1%. All right, awareness. That's what it took for me. And then after that, man, drinking less alcohol was easy. It wasn't even like a choice because my primary focus was getting that sleep dialed in. And anything that's got in my way of dialing in the sleep just threw overboard right away. So there has to be other ways that you can find to bring awareness to your decision making and bring awareness to the effects that your decision making is having on your life. And I know I don't have all the answers, to be honest, with that. But starting over with a fast sounds like a darn good one. And then adding things back in as necessary seems to be a good approach to take. And maybe we'll explore more of that in the future. But the bottom line here is that there are a number of normal day-to-day things you can do. Eat well, sleep well, exercise, move around, have community, have purpose, and use the data that you have in your life to drive your decision making. And that's why another reason why I like calorie counting. It's like you count the calories, you see what's going on. It draws your attention to the effects of consuming food has on your goal of losing weight. It doesn't work for everybody, but it works for a lot of people, and it works for me. Data awareness is really helpful. Dr. Deep, I really appreciate this entire conversation. This is a really, truly salient conversation to have these days. We are honestly in unprecedented times with the level of bombardment around us from this toxic environment, whether it be media or pornography or food, processed food, or even airborne pathogens or something in the water, or who the hell knows what it is. But there is something seriously wrong with our society today, where the evidence is clear and growing and definitive. Increased levels of anxiety and depression, obvious explosion, obesity and diabetes. We are mentally and physically unwell in a way that really describes some level of catastrophic event happening in our society. And it's happened like relatively all of a sudden in historical terms in the last blink of a few decades. So we need to really examine our modern environment. And I know I sound like a freaking hippie with this, some sort of granola weirdo, but it's true. There's no denying the data anymore. And there's no denying the number of impacts and exogenous impacts on you and substances entering into your body that are changing your neurochemical pathways, your hormonal pathways, your thoughts, your feelings, your urges, your desires, things that make you happy, we're losing control. And we have to take control in order to just survive in a healthy, functioning way. Stay tuned to Rebel Health Alliance here on YouTube. We're going to talk about all this stuff in the future. We're going to help you figure out a way to live a happy, healthy life, even wealthier life. Check us out at rebelhealthalliance.io. Check out somebody else. I don't care. Just get some help in dealing with all this stuff, please. Watch our last video right here. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, share it with your friends, and please help spread the word. Thank you so much, Dr. Deep. Thank you very much for being here, and we are out.